Hi guys, today I'm going to be doing a belated January wrap up. I know I'm a bit late on this, but I've been ill and then I've been away working, so it is a bit late, but I still really wanted to show you everything I read in January. I think I'm going to talk a bit about my reading taste so far this year because they have changed a lot to start off with before I get into the books, because this year I feel so relaxed about my reading. I felt so much pressure. I didn't realise how much pressure I felt to read a certain amount of books or to read a certain type of book. But this year I've decided to just read whatever I want, whatever I decide to read, whatever I feel like I'm in the mood for, and it has made my reading so much more enjoyable and I'm really enjoying it again, and I've got into a really good routine with my reading, so I'm so happy with that. And I think that this wrap up really reflects my changing tastes, and I hope you'll really enjoy hearing about some of the books too. So I started off the year by reading Second Best Friend by Pratt, which is a novella published by Barrington Stoke, who publish books in a way that is accessible to people who are reluctant readers or have dyslexia or something that affects your reading. And I really like them in terms of the size of the font and the way that the page is set out, and also the colours of the pages. I think they're a really good place if you have dyslexia or are a reluctant reader. I think that you should definitely check out the Barrington Stoke books. This is a YA book and I love Pratt's writing. She also wrote Unboxed for Barrington Stoke, and she's also published 3 other YA books, and I have loved and read them all. And I really liked this. I loved how it detailed competitive friendship and this rivalry, even though you're best friends, and sometimes being close to someone has a negative impact on you both, even if you don't realise it. And I liked the intensity of the relationship and how it wasn't problematic. There wasn't anything wrong with it. It wasn't abusive or anything like that, but there was clearly something wrong with the dynamic, and I loved how Non wrote that and how interesting that was, and how it really did feel like the main characters thought she was the second best friend, but really the other girl who she was friends with had no clue about this, and how actually we just need to talk to each other. And I also loved how it talked about politics and how engaged teenagers can be in politics, and how we can make teenagers aware of the political environment and how teenagers can practice politics even if they can't vote. And so I thought it was a really lovely book, and I gave it 5 stars, which is based on a novella rating. I tend to rate novellas and novels a bit differently, so I gave this one 5 stars and thought it was a really nice place to start the year. For my second book of the year, I went for a book that everybody's been talking about, and for very good reason. I can't believe I haven't read it up until now, but I'm really glad that I finally did, and it is The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. This was incredible, and as you read it you feel like you're reading a piece of history, something that's never been written before but is so necessary and so important to read. But I don't even want to talk about it in terms of how important it is, because I feel like other people have talked about that so much, and in terms of me talking about it, my voice is definitely not the most important. But actually I thought this was a very enjoyable read, and a very different read from everything else I've usually read, particularly in contemporary, because I read a lot of contemporary, I write a lot of contemporary, but I do feel like a lot of contemporary out there is very much the same. And so I think it's really important that publishers are taking note and publishing lots of different voices within YA contemporary, and I think The Hate You Give is a really good example of that. This is about 17-year-old Star, who is stuck between 2 worlds, the world that she lives in and the world that she goes to school in. And the book really starts when she goes to a party and drives off with her friend, who then gets pulled over and killed by the police. It was inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement, and it's also being made into a film, which I'm so excited for. I feel like it's going to be such a good adaptation, and I also can't wait for Angie's next book, which comes out later this year. I gave this 5 stars, and even if you don't really like reading YA, I know there are some of you that watch my channel that are a bit meh about YA now, I still think you should read this, because I think it's a book for everybody, not just for teenagers, not just for adults. It is a book that everybody should read. One of my favourite books of the month was The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy, and I hadn't read a Thomas Hardy book since October, when I read Two on a Tower for Victober, and I realised how much I missed his writing and can't wait to read more and more this year. The Woodlanders was a book that I'd wanted to read for a while, because I'd heard that it wasn't one of the more traumatic Thomas Hardy books, but let me tell you, I cried my eyes out. I bawled like a baby at the end of this, because I was so sad at some of the events experience. And I was so glad that I read it, and I felt like it was a really good book in terms of feeling a bit hopeful at the end, but there was also this really sad thing that happened. I don't want to spoil it, but I was crying at something like midnight and I just couldn't stop, and I loved this book. This is about Grace Melbury, who has gone away to school and then comes back to the village that she's grown up in, and it's a very typical rural village. The characters in the Woodlanders live and work in the woods, and I really liked how quaint this was. It's one of the best Thomas Hardy books I've read so far that really details the landscape, and I know all of them do, but I felt like the Woodlanders particularly was good at describing the place that it is set, and I love that about it. So Grace has come back from school and she doesn't exactly fit into Little Hintock anymore, and she's been betrothed to a man called Giles, and they still think that they're going to marry each other, and that has been promised to them ever since they were young. But then Grace meets Dr. Fitzpiers, and if you've read or watched Far From the Madding Crowd, you'll know about Bathsheba and Sergeant Troy, and I thought that Grace and Dr. Fitzpiers had a very similar dynamic, which I thought was very interesting, and I think I actually preferred it in the Woodlanders just because it felt a lot more realistic, and I really think that these are the characters that Thomas Hardy writes best. When they make questionable decisions, you think, why did you do that? But you can see why they did. You can see their thought process and everything that has influenced them. Because I loved the Woodlanders so much, I decided to read some more Thomas Hardy, and I went for The Withered Arm, which is a collection of 2 short stories published in the Penguin Little Black Classics range. It was a really good book to pick up that I could read really quickly but still get a lot out of, and I thought it was a very interesting book that, even though it was short, had that gasp factor that I love the most about Thomas Hardy, when you're like, I knew this was coming, but I can't believe this has actually happened. And The Withered Arm is quite supernatural for Thomas Hardy. A lot of his books are very much steeped in realism, but this had a supernatural twist to it. And it's about a woman who has had a son with a farmer out of wedlock, and then the farmer then marries, and the woman who had the child with him has a dream about his new wife and how she clutches her arm, and then in real life the woman's arm actually becomes withered and she can't use it, and there is a really big twist at the end, and I love that about it, and it's one I'm going to be going back to hopefully at some point as well. And the other short story in there too was maybe not as hard hitting but still very good and had a nice twist to it as well. So I really loved this, and I think that if you've read a Thomas Hardy novel, this might be a good place to start next. One of my big aims for 2018 was to read some Charles Dickens books, and I thought if I don't start now, I'll leave it to the end of the year and then I won't read as much as I want to, and so I decided I was going to read Great Expectations. I'm so glad that I read this book because I really enjoyed it. I found it fascinating to read, and I talked about it in my Unexpected Female Heroines video, which you can go and watch, because I talked about Estella and Miss Havisham in it and why I found them so interesting to read about. For those of you who don't know, Great Expectations is about a boy called Pip who is an orphan and is raised by his sister, and you go through the first bit of the book learning about his childhood and his upbringing, and then at the end of the first part he comes into money, and that means that he can be educated and go to London, and all these wonderful things happen to him. But you learn that actually the money and him coming into this fortune is just where the book begins, and all sorts of other weird and wonderful things happen in it. I really loved Pip as a character, but I do think my favourite character was Herbert Pocket. I thought he was so sweet and really quite a blundering fool. He reminded me a lot of Mr. Bingley from Pride and Prejudice in a funny sort of way. I just loved him, and I loved his relationship with Pip, and I really liked how you had this friendship and you also had this romance, and both of them played against each other, and I loved the way that Charles Dickens wrote about that. I'm definitely going to be reading more Charles Dickens this year. I think I might read A Tale of Two Cities next, and then towards the end of the year I'm definitely going to read A Christmas Carol. This has definitely sparked my love for Charles Dickens's books, and I just can't wait to read more. Another book I read as part of my classics I want to read in 2018 video was The Colossus by Sylvia Plath, and I'm also trying to read a poetry collection every month because I really want to write some more poetry, and I also want to get into different styles of poetry, and so I'm going to try and set myself that challenge. And I thought The Colossus would be a great place to start because I really loved Ariel when I read it. I don't think I loved the Colossus just as much. I didn't feel like there was as much cohesion with the poems that were featured in it, and you can definitely tell that it's her first poetry collection because I really feel like she finds her voice in Ariel and really fine-tunes the poems. Where the Colossus worked, the poems were great, but I didn't have that connection to them as I did with Ariel, because as you read Ariel, you go on a journey with it, and the Colossus in comparison felt quite disjointed. So I didn't hate it, but I also didn't love it. And I feel like it takes getting to Ariel to find those genius poems, whereas these were just very good. Another one of my favourite books of January, and one I'm completely obsessed with now, is The Essex Serpent by Sara Perry. This is another book that's been very hyped, but I don't even think that hyped is the right word because I'm more circulating the YA/classics community. This was more hyped in the literary world, or I don't even know where to categorise this. I feel like you would categorise it as literary fiction, but it also crosses the boundaries into historical fiction. And I loved it because I love historical fiction. I really want to read more this year, but it had a really nice twist to it. So it is about a woman called Cora Seaborn who at the start of the book is widowed. And you might think this is a book about mourning, but really it's a book about finding yourself after the death of someone who has really taken over your life for a long time. And Cora is still young at the start of the book and has a whole life ahead of her, and she moves to Essex where she hears about the Essex Serpent, which has caused lots of people to die, and you're not sure during the book whether the Essex Serpent is real or whether it is a figment of the people's imaginations. And I love that about it, how it treads the line between supernatural and realism. Cora is an amazing main character because she's so interested in science, and I think that the best thing about the book is how it takes a Victorian narrative and is very much written in this kind of Victorian style, but because it's not written in Victorian times and because it's not governed by these questions of morality, it can actually push forward this female narrative and prove just how amazing the Victorians were and how progressive they were as well. I definitely think it's going to be the most beautiful book that I read this year because it was written so beautifully and imaginatively, and I can't wait to read her debut book, which isn't a historical one but I did buy. And also she has another book coming out in the autumn called Melmoth, which I can't wait to read. It started my love for Sara Perry's books now, and I just can't get enough of her writing. Then I read another YA book, which was A Rebel of the Sands by Alwyn Hamilton, and I'm quite glad that I read this book because although I did enjoy it, I also found that I needed to read it because I needed to realise just how much I've gone off YA fantasy. And for a long time, YA fantasy has been the it thing, the thing that's on all the bestseller lists, the things that get most of the attention. And actually I don't really like YA fantasy, and I realised that I'd kind of been forcing myself to read it and forcing myself to like it because I used to be obsessed with Sarah J Maas's books. You'll know if you've watched my channel for a while that that's definitely not a thing anymore, and I do feel like I was trying to make myself like it and trying to make myself read it, and it's just not for me. It's not something that I enjoy writing or reading, and the type of fantasy out there is a fantasy that I don't really enjoy. I much prefer my fantasy to be fantasy realism, where there is this fantasy world but actually there's no magic involved. I don't really like that magic fantasy side of it. I much prefer kind of medieval fantasy, and that's just what I'm comfortable with reading. And so it was really good that I did read Rebel of the Sands because it just made me realise how much I don't really want to read YA fantasy anymore, and I'd rather read something else. So Rebel of the Sands may be your thing, but even though I enjoyed it, it did make me realise that fantasy just isn't my thing. And then the final book that I read in January was another collection of poetry, and this was Selected Poems by Sir Walter Scott. I don't hear a lot about Sir Walter Scott, but I'm trying to read all of his books and lots of his poetry, and I thought this was a great one to figure out what I should read and when I should read it and in what order, because it does take poems from poems. So he wrote a lot of epic poems and then it takes extracts from those epic poems. I much preferred the individual poems, and I feel like I've been spoiled because my favourite poet is Emily Bronte, and she drew very heavily from Byron and Sir Walter Scott. but I think that Emily is better than Sir Walter Scott, and although I loved this, I couldn't help comparing it to some of Emily's poems and realising just how good they are. I'm going to talk about Sir Walter Scott in greater detail once I've read more of his works, so keep an eye out for a classics video at some point in the future, because I'm going to be reading some more of his novels certainly in the next few months. So that was my January wrap up. I really hope you enjoyed this video. In the comments below, let me know what you read in January. I'd love to know your favourite book and maybe a book that you didn't enjoy as much. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. Happy reading!